I'm joined on the line by U.S. Republican strategist Greg Swenson, who has been monitoring development from London. Hello, Swenson. Hi, Greg.
Hello, Georgina.
Welcome to the program. Now, what do you think of the rule to be applied in this debate? There will be no audience. The candidates' microphones will be muted when it's not their turn to speak, and there will be no notes allowed. What do you think of this?
I think it's a challenge in some ways for both candidates. Kamala Harris did not want the mute button because I think the campaign saw how much that mute button, the off mic, was an advantage for President Trump on the June 27th debate. And even though the Biden campaign was the campaign that wanted the mute button. So I think they were afraid of interruptions from Trump. And I think it benefited President Trump because it kept him more in control, and it didn't look like he was losing his cool, and he had to keep silent during those moments. So it's probably an advantage for Trump. I think the disadvantage for Trump is not having the audience. He does very well with audience feedback or applause or any kind of positive reinforcement. Whereas I think Vice President Harris has a tendency to go off script if not focused on the teleprompter and go into word salad, as they call it. And I think that that's a disadvantage for her. As far as no notes, might be a disadvantage for both. Both do better with the teleprompter. I think when President Trump dictates facts and figures and data, he's much better because of his record in his administration, his economic record especially, but also his record on the border. Those are issues that really depend on facts and figures. And I think it would be nice to have those notes. I don't know if he'll be able to memorize the important ones.
All right, talking about the debate and facts and figures, how will this be fact-checked, and what role will fact-checking play in the post-debate analysis?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I mean, I think a lot of the fact-checking on President Trump is pretty hyped up. He does use hyperbole for sure, but those are things like saying something is great or the greatest. Was the economy under Trump the greatest? Maybe not compared to the Reagan years, but it's inarguable that he had a very good economic outcome. So I'm not sure it's fair to do the really hardcore fact-checking on him. I think when it's obvious, it should be challenged. I think that's where President Biden got into real trouble on June 27th. He said that no American servicemen or women had died under his watch. And that was blatantly wrong, and everybody knew it was wrong. So, I think there's moments where there needs to be corrections, and on both sides. And I'm not trying to be partisan on this, but I think that when they overdo it and sort of pick on exaggerations or opinions or subjective things. So I think both candidates run a risk there. Both President Trump is, he's a frequent user of hyperbole, that's for sure. He likes to exaggerate. But I think Vice President Kamala Harris, has a tendency to go off on these tangents and word salads. And I think, sometimes she's able to speak quite a bit without really saying anything substantial. So, I'm not sure that's fair, but it can't be fact checked. If she talks about hope and joy, that's not something you can really correct. So I hope that the media is fair on this. I'm not sure, that the best forum is ABC News for a Republican. Obviously, it's a very left-leaning station. And that's another advantage for Vice President Harris.
All right, let me pick your brains now. What are your projections on how they will perform in the debate? What should the viewers look out for?
Georgina, I got out of the prediction business with President Trump. It's really tough to call. I'll answer it with an if-then. If he stays on message and he stays disciplined and doesn't lose his cool and talks about the economy, inflation, and the border, those are the top issues for Americans. And he leads on those issues. He's leading Kamala Harris by 10 to 20 points on those issues. If he stays on script and talks about the issues, he will do great. If he loses his cool, he will not. As for Vice President Harris, she spent the last 8 or 10 weeks hiding from the media, has done no press conferences, only one softball interview with CNN, very friendly interview with her support person in Tim Walz. It's not something that voters are going to buy into after a while. There was a Kamala mania. There was a lot of positive hype. I think tonight she's going to have to talk about her record because Trump will challenge her on it. She's going to have to talk about policies, which she's done very little of. So I think it could be a really revealing evening. It could end up being a draw. It's hard to predict, but I think if Trump stays on message, he will do really well.
Well, what about Kamala? Well, there are certain areas you would agree that she has, done quite a bit well. In your view, what are the areas you feel she has some strengths in?
Well, obviously, she's got a personality. She's very warm with the audience. She's really developed this image all of a sudden of hope and joy and positivity, and that's sometimes refreshing in politics, which can be so negative. But the problem is 10 weeks ago, she was polling in the mid-30s, and she was considered the lowest rated vice president in modern history. Even people in her own party and left-leaning media like the New York Times were very critical of her and were suggesting even earlier this year that the party would be better off getting rid of her as the vice president, or at least as the vice presidential nominee, because it was a drag on Biden. And if something had happened to Biden, there was a person in Vice President Harris who probably wouldn't have been in the top 5 if there was a nomination process. So she's a very weak candidate. She came in, she dropped out before Iowa in 2020. She never polled over 2% in the national polls and was ranked number 7 in South Carolina, which is a state where the Democrat primary vote is very favorable for African Americans. So she's a flawed candidate. So I think that they've done an incredible job, the campaign and the media that supported the campaign, in elevating her and re-imaging her, remarketing her. And they've turned her into from this flawed candidate into a really well-liked, popular candidate with a ton of enthusiasm from her own party. So that's the good news. The bad news is they have not appealed to moderates or independents. They've just gone back to the base. They've elevated the enthusiasm levels in the base by talking about her, progressive policies. And that's not going to do it with independents. That's why Trump is still up 5 points with independents. She's not really appealed to moderates. Maybe she'll do that tonight.
Let's talk about their foreign policy approaches. I know it differs. What are the potential implications of this to global relations?
Yeah, that's, I think, a place where they are different. President Trump is much more behind and supportive of Israel, and he had accomplished such great things in the Middle East. There was peace and prosperity. He'd put together these Abraham Accords between the Sunni Arab states and Israel. It was a real success. There was no outbreak of war, and Vice President Harris is much more on the fence. She, quite deliberately did not choose the best choice for vice president, which was Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. She definitely was pressured by the pro-Hamas wing in the party. So those are big differences between the two on Israel and Hamas specifically, but also on the Middle East in general. And I think Vice President Harris has showed her true colors in the choice of Tim Walz. On the other hand, I think there's also differences in the Ukraine-Russia situation. Kamala Harris has embraced the hawkish stance of the Democrat Party, which is, very different than 20 years ago, where Republicans were considered the hawkish party. I think President Trump, really wants to have a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. I don't know that he can accomplish that. It's speculation. Whereas Kamala Harris has been all in on supporting Ukraine and NATO. And I think that, that might be a difference, but I would assume from looking at the polls that President Trump's foreign policy views are actually more moderate than Kamala Harris's. He's right down the mainstream center on that issue. That's what might be one reason he's polling 4 points ahead of Vice President Harris on foreign affairs.
All right. Before I let you go, Greg, what do you think will be the implications of this debate in the upcoming election? How is it going to influence the decisions of the voters?
Well, I think it could be really important. There's no doubt that, Vice President Harris hasn't really been scrutinized on her record and her policy. So if President Trump can can stay disciplined and talk about her record and her policies and the difference between the two and his success, I think that will have a meaningful impact. These debates don't always have a major impact on the election. There's sometimes a small bump in the polls, but sometimes they're really, really significant. We saw that on June 27th, where it was essentially the end of President Biden.
All right. Thank you so much for your insight. Really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Greg
Regina.
Swenson there, U.S. Republican strategist, who's joined us on the program today.